Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Mehta Stein, the Executive Director of California Common Cause. We're coming to you live yet again from my guest bedroom / home office for another episode of Lunch with California Common Cause. Thanks for joining us. At California Common Cause, we're trying to build a democracy that includes everyone. So what does that actually mean? It means we have to change the fact that participation in voting, participation in political giving, participation in census, and participation in the redrawing of district lines all tend to leave out the same groups of people over and over. People of color, young people, people with disabilities, and so on. This is just as true in California as it is anywhere else. Yes, California has adopted most major policy items on the voting rights wish list. Automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, which is coming online across the state this year, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, vote centers that allow you to vote at any site in a county, and so on. And yet, California's voter turnout rate is in the lower half of the nation. Turnout rates for Latino and Asian American voters in California are lower than their voter turnout rates nationally. And California's voter participation disparities by race and by age have not gotten any smaller over the course of the last decade. These disparities in participation then turn into disparities in representation. Take people of color as just one of several examples. Fewer vote, fewer engage in the political system, fewer give politically, and all of that makes it harder for candidates who come from those communities and would represent those communities with governing to run for office and to win election. That's why today in America, white men are 31% of the population, but 65% of elected officials. Women of color, by contrast, 19% of the US population, 4% of elected officials. We at California Common Cause want to build a democracy that has room for everyone. We want to lower barriers to voting, to civic participation in areas other than voting, and ultimately to representation. So we're going to talk about these issues today and talk about more than that with our guest, Rosalind Gold. Rosalind Gold is the Chief Public Policy Officer at NALEO, the National Association for Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, NALEO Educational Fund. Rosalind has spent more than 3 decades working in and for the Latino community on naturalization, voting rights, redistricting, and the decennial census. So let's pull Rosalind up and I'll welcome her to join the conversation. Rosalind, hi, thanks for joining us.
Great. Jonathan, thank you so much. And I also want to express my sincere appreciation to California Common Cause for inviting me to be part of this important discussion for lunch.
Of course, of course. So we work together all the time. Rosalind and I have partnered on work going back years. California Common Cause partners frequently with NALEO. Rosalind, why don't you start by just telling us what NALEO does and why?
Well, our mission at the NALEO Educational Fund is to facilitate full Latino participation in the American political process. We believe our democracy is stronger, both in California and nationwide, if it is responsive and accountable and inclusive of all of the voices in our nation. We use 3 strategies to facilitate Latino participation. First, we work directly with the Latino community to promote the opportunities of US citizenship and assist Latinos through the naturalization process. We work with a community to promote census participation, very important. This is a census year. And we also do nonpartisan voter engagement. With our constituency of more than 6,800 Latino elected and appointed officials nationwide, we promote and provide professional development opportunities to ensure that Latinos can govern their communities as effectively as possible. And then finally, and this is a lot of the work that I've been doing, we promote public policies that address barriers to Latino participation and ensure that our electoral process is as inclusive and as accessible as possible to Latinos in all California.
So Rosalind, Latinos are the state's largest racial and ethnic group in California, making up about 40% of the state's population. Compare that for us, if you could, to the levels of voting and civic participation in the Latino community.
Well, if we look at voting, and you had mentioned this earlier, we know that the Latino the Latino voting rates are lower than the rates of non-Hispanic whites. If we look at census data from the most recent presidential elections, 2012 and 2016, we see that less than half, about 48%, 47% of Latinos who are eligible to vote, Latino voting age citizens, less than half of them cast ballots in California, compared to non-Hispanic whites, who are almost 2/3, about 64% of non-Hispanic white voting age citizens cast their ballot in those presidential elections. And that pattern is something that we see nationwide. Disparities may be different in some states or others, but you still have those lower participation rates. The number of Latinos who are voting continues to increase. Going back to 2000, we had a bit over 1 million Latinos voting. In our November 2016 election, we had about 3.3 million Latinos voting. But because the Latinos who are eligible to vote keeps growing so dramatically, the rate of participation is still lagging.
Right, and that lack of participation, or that lower rate of participation in voting, is mirrored in census, right?
Yes, it is. Right. In the last census, there was what we call a differential undercount. In other words, if we look at how many people were overcounted and how many people were undercounted, there was a net undercount of about 1.5% of the Latino population. And so we know we still have a way to go in making sure that every Latino is counted now that it's Census 2020.
So what are the barriers, or maybe share some of the barriers, that Latino voters face when casting their ballots in California and around the nation? Why do we see Latino underrepresentation in the electorate cycle after cycle?
So we like to say information plus invitation equals participation. So let me start with information. Many Latinos lack basic information about the process of registering to vote and how to cast a ballot in California. For example, we have a hotline, 1-888-VEY-VOTA, go and vote. And almost all of our hotline calls are about basic things like, where do I find my poll? Why aren't I on the registration rolls? How do I find out if I'm registered to vote? What time do the polls close? And Latinos have also told us that they lack information about candidates on the ballot, especially judges or state legislators. So they may be reluctant to vote without the information they need. In addition, Latinos, about 1 out of 5 Latino voting age citizens in California is not yet fully fluent in English. So there are language barriers for access to information for Latinos. The second part is what we call invitation. The fact is that candidates and parties and your traditional political actors don't do outreach to voters who aren't fully participating, or what they call low propensity voters. So Latinos get ignored by candidates, they get ignored by political campaigns. Without that outreach, that's an important invitation to participate. And in California, we also have the problem that during presidential years, California isn't considered a battleground state by many presidential candidates. So they don't invest in outreach to Latinos in California, but California has the largest Latino electorate in any state in the nation. So you don't have that kind of outreach and work to fully engage Latinos in the process.
There's this really sort of pernicious cycle that exists with under participation in voting, in that the campaigns have to make efficient choices with their resources. And so they're saying, okay, we can reach out to or door knock at a limited number of households. Which households are we going to prioritize? And so what they do is they prioritize commonly, not every campaign, but many, prioritize households that are 4 out of 5s or 5 out of 5s. What does that terminology mean? It means that that's a household that has voted in 4 out of the 5 most recent elections, or 5 out of the 5 most recent elections. It's a way of identifying who your most reliable voters are, because you want to convince those people to vote for you. Well, what that means is that people who aren't participating are left out of the next round of outreach and campaigning, and thus are less likely to participate in this election, and thus, as a result of not participating in this election, are less likely to receive outreach in the next election, and so on forever. And I worked in the Asian American community for quite a number of years, and it was the exact same dynamic. It was, research showed dramatically less outreach from campaigns, candidates, and parties among low propensity Asian American households. It's the same dynamic, I think, in both communities. So I want to make sure that we touch on the other areas outside of well, actually, no, before we move off of voting, I want to talk about this. It's an election year. What messages and what messengers best motivate Latino voters to turn out to vote, according to NALEO's research?
So we've conducted both surveys of nationally representative samples of the Latino population and focus groups, and we have generally learned that the best message is one that focuses on representing your community.
Oh, Rosalind, it looks like you froze, which is not uncommon in the world of Zoom. Let's hope you rejoin us, though I could.
How voting helps. How's this? Is this better?
Much better, yeah. So,
okay, great. So as I was saying, the best messages are those which focus on how voting is good for your community and allows you to represent your community. You know, many of the Latinos who are not engaged, it's not because they're not interested in politics. They're very interested in politics, but they don't see the connection between casting a vote and changes that'll address their life. Another message we found, and this is not for everybody in the Latino community, but there is some segment of the Latino community that reacts very strongly with a resistance message. In these times, voting is a way to fight discrimination against Latinos. So in terms of messengers, first of all, consistently, you start with your family. Bottom line is, if your mother tells you to vote, you're gonna vote. We find that often female family members or significant others are very good messengers. And then the other messengers, unlike some groups which feel that you should get like a famous celebrity like Jennifer Lopez or Pitbull, we find that Latinos, the celebrities in their lives are people like teachers, first responders, nurses. These are the people who have the most credibility to reach Latinos. Now, that's the research we did before the pandemic. Things have changed dramatically for the ways that people are going to be casting ballots and how they're going to feel about voting. That's why we're so delighted that California Common Cause is going to be doing research on what messages and messengers work for different groups in California, and we're going to be happy to collaborate with Common Cause on that effort.
Yeah, it's an exciting project. We're leading with the Center for Social Innovation at UC Riverside with generous support from the Haas Junior Fund, and it's an attempt to figure out, in this new upside down environment in which COVID sort of rules our lives, how do we best communicate to people about voting amid a pandemic? And what messages will explain to people the changes coming in the November 2020 election. And if those changes are new to you, as a listener, I would recommend checking out past episodes of Lunch with California Common Cause, including last week, in which I did a solo version of the show. I don't know if it's a show, a live stream, in which I talked about the executive orders and the bills that are moving in Sacramento to reshape our November 2020 election to prepare Californians to vote safely and accessibly amid a pandemic. Rosalind, you mentioned that one of the very effective messengers in the Latino community is family. And I think that's true in the Asian American community as well, though I don't have the research to back it up in the way that you do. One thing I find really interesting in immigrant families is that sometimes at least anecdotally, the message is inverted. Instead of going from parents to children, sometimes it's going from children to parents. There is this sort of Norman Rockwell image of a parent taking their child by the hand into the voting booth and letting them participate as a young tot in the voting process. But for many immigrant families in California and around the nation, It is second generation Americans, second generation immigrants, first generation Americans who are a younger generation who are learning the American democratic process without the aid of a prior generation walking them to it, and then bringing their parents and bringing their grandparents in. And I wonder if, and I've seen this in my own life, and I've seen this certainly in the Asian American community. I have friends in the Latino community who sort of help their parents vote. And I'm wondering if there's any, in your findings around family members being effective messengers, if there's any sort of intergenerational dynamics that you've observed.
Well, I think that as we do research with the Latino community, our research really underscores that there's actually enormous diversity within the Latino community. So finding the best messages and messengers, for example, for a Latino family that's third or fourth generation living in the Central Valley, they've been there many years, everybody in the family is native born, the messages and messengers are going to work very differently than a family where the parent is a naturalized citizen in Los Angeles. And like you said, you have those intergenerational dynamics, right? So we have to really think about all of those different groups when we think about messages and messengers. We've also been using that dynamic in our census outreach, because we know that many Latino parents will be going to their children for help in filling out the census form. So a lot of our messaging around the census is how this is really for the whole family. One of the good things about the census that we can tell people is everybody counts.
Right. So this is a great transition. Voting is not the same as representation, and voting is not the only form of civic engagement. Why don't you share a little bit about other parts of NALEO's work to build a more equitable democracy, both, if you could, census and redistricting?
Great. So yes, for the last 3 decades, we have had one of the leading nonprofit programs to mobilize Latinos to participate in the census. And it's been a comprehensive program of education, outreach, engaging Latinos about why the census is important to their communities, what you need to do to fill out the form. And this has taken on a much greater saliency because of 2020. The 2020 census, even before the pandemic, is dramatically different from any census that we've conducted in our nation before. First of all, to achieve both cost efficiencies and to take advantage of new technology, the Census Bureau has made an online option available and has actually been pushing online response in many communities. Well, we know that for some Latinos and other people of color, there may not be great access to broadband access or to the technology. And we've actually done a lot of studies that show many Latinos prefer to use the paper form, mail a paper form in as their primary response. So we had to adjust our outreach in light of that. Second, the Bureau has not invested the same level of resources in kind of field outreach. They've centralized some of their operations, and they may not have had the field presence we expected. And also there were, very dramatic changes that were going to be made to the questions on race and Hispanic origin, but their changes were not made. And so those questions are still confusing. And if, I can talk about that a little later if anyone wants to hear more about that. So that was before the pandemic. Well, when the pandemic came, first of all, much of what the Bureau would normally be doing in the field had to be delayed, because the Bureau, if people don't respond by mail or online or by phone, they would send people out to the field to actually go door to door, called non-response follow-up. Well, the Bureau, because of the public health environment, had to dramatically delay that. In addition, many field operations of questionnaire assistance, whether it was by the Bureau of people out there helping people to learn about answering the questionnaire, having a kiosk where people could fill out the form, having a community event, we all had to adjust to that, and the bureaus had to do so as well. And then with respect to redistricting, again, we have been very involved in mobilizing the Latino community to participate in the redistricting process. I think this is an area where over the last decades, we have gotten maps that are more responsive to providing Latinos a fair opportunity to select the candidates of their choice. And we will be doing that work again come the next redistricting cycle, although we're going to have to deal with a delay in the delivery of census data because of the challenges the Bureau is facing. So we are still going to be continuing our work to get a fair and accurate count of Latinos in Census 20, but we definitely have some challenges ahead, and we're really monitoring how things are going with respect to the count. And then we are really looking at how that's going to change our ability to have fair redistricting.
Can you share just a little bit about redistricting cycles in the past in which the California state legislature drew its own district lines and what outcomes Latino communities saw with respect to, as everybody I'm sure knows, districts can be drawn in a way that keeps communities together, allows them to speak with one voice and elect people who either come from the community and represent them, or at the very least have to listen to the Latino community in order to win votes. By contrast, badly drawn lines can split communities, can crack or pack communities, and really dilute their political power. I'm wondering if you can share just any stories you have from past redistricting cycles in which the Latino that impacted the Latino community, and then today, what is your hope for this next cycle that's about to begin?
In one of the past redistrictings, the statewide redistrictings, before the commission was created, basically the congressional elected officials worked out a deal among themselves where they would create districts that would protect incumbents. They didn't even want to do it to give one party an advantage over the other. They just wanted to redistrict in a way where the partisan balance of power would stay the same. So in doing that redistricting and protecting the incumbents in the San Fernando Valley, where there was a growing Latino population, they split the Latino community between two neighboring districts in the San Fernando Valley. And after the new commission drew its maps and could not look at incumbency as a criteria, a San Fernando Valley district was created where we had the first Latino elected to Congress from the San Fernando Valley after the 2010 redistricting. A second story is in Los Angeles County, and this is one of the earliest cases where it was just very clear. This was in the late 80s, where the Board of Supervisors at the time, again, was very concerned about the growth of the Latino community in LA County. They split the Latino community up between 4 different supervisorial districts. That one we were not able to address until there was litigation brought under the Voting Rights Act, where they showed that there was intentional discrimination against Latinos to prevent Latinos from getting fair representation. After that lawsuit, the lines were much more fair, and we got the first Latina elected to the Board of Supervisors. So as we go into the next redistricting cycle, we're going to be looking statewide in California, both to make sure that the maps provide fair representation for Latinos in terms of the growth of the community. But the other thing we're going to have to think about is if we can't get a good, fair, and accurate count in California, we could lose a congressional district.
Right.
And if we lose a congressional district, that's another possibility of us not getting the representation we need. So really, we're going to first, that's why all this work fits together in a continuum, right? We have to make sure there's a fair count. We have to make sure the districts are fair. And then we have to make sure Latinos turn out and vote in those districts.
Yeah, it's all integrated. If any of our listeners are interested in learning more about Census, we had an episode, again, I don't know if these are episodes, we had a live stream a couple weeks ago with Keisha Morris Desir, who works on census and prison gerrymandering at Common Cause's DC office. So you can do a deep dive on census if you're interested. Rosalind and I have both mentioned that the new redistricting cycle is just opening. In fact, tomorrow is the drawing of the ping pong balls. So there aren't a lot of moments of drama or levity in, the process of standing up an independent citizen-run redistricting commission. Critically important work, but not full of laughs necessarily. The process of taking the thousands of citizen applicants from across California and turning that into a 14-member independent citizen-run redistricting commission is at its final stages. So we're down to a final 35, tomorrow in Sacramento, the state auditor's office will draw 8 ping pong balls out of 35 to determine the first 8 members of the CRC, the Citizens Redistricting Commission, and then those 8 will have an opportunity to select from the remaining pool 6 more members who can balance the racial diversity, gender diversity, geographic diversity, ideological diversity of the commission. And so we hope actually to potentially, if we're allowed, live stream that so that people can watch the ping pong balls being pulled in real time. If that's the sort of thing you're into. It's sort of like the NBA lottery, which is a subject I could do an entirely different series of live streams about. Go Warriors. Okay, we're moving on. Let's talk more about the future. Rosalind, 1 in 4 American young people is Latino. California will someday be majority Latino. California is about 40% Latino today, and I think it's a matter of time until California is majority Latino. How do you see that changing our democracy, both nationally and California, into the future?
So really, there are, really basically 2 scenarios that could evolve. One is if we continue on the path that we're on, even though the Latino population will grow, if we don't have a strategy to engage Latinos, to provide Latinos the information needed to fully participate, we will still have a lag where most of our voters are white and male, even though the population is majority Latino. And, this is also going to be a challenge because we know that younger voters don't participate as much, and that you really need to do a lot of extra outreach and information to younger voters who, maybe don't see the connection between voting and the issues they care about, or again, they're new to the system, so they need information. So that's the scenario for a while if we don't dramatically change how we engage Latinos and we mobilize Latinos to participate. If we do, I think with full participation of Latinos, one of the things that we know is that, Latinos look to make sure that elected officials address the issues that they care about. Right now, at this moment in time, the issues from polling that we've seen by partners like Latino Decisions, you ask Latinos in California, what are the issues they care about the most? Interestingly, it's very similar to the issues that all Californians care about. Access to affordable health care, economic opportunities, good jobs, good income, right? Immigration at different times becomes a higher issue of importance to Latinos. Right now, it's not up there as high as the 2 issues I mentioned, as well as the COVID challenge. So I think what we'd hope to see is that we would see elected officials addressing these issues that Latinos care about. But I think that is, like I said, this is something that is going to be good for all Californians because the issues that Latinos care about are critical to the quality of life of Californians, no matter what their age, their race, or their ethnicity is.
Rosalind, what I'm hearing you say is that demographic change is not destiny. It is not the case that simply because Latinos are becoming a larger and larger share of California, they will become a larger and larger share of the California power structure, or that their views and needs will be considered by decision makers, that there's still tons of work to be done to build a more inclusive democracy and to make sure that Latino voices are heard. We're gonna take a minute or two here, or in a minute or two here, we're going to take questions from our viewers. We have a couple questions already. And so if you're watching and you have a question for Rosalind or myself, please do leave it in the comments and we'll bring it into the conversation. One last question from me though, Rosalind, before we go to our viewers, what inspires you personally to do the work of building a better and more representative democracy?
Well, I am very fortunate because I'm a native Californian, and when I started to work with the organization 30 years ago, I wasn't quite sure what were the issues that I was most passionate about, but I got hooked very early on the future of the state and understanding that as the democracy of the state goes and as our demographic changes go, the diversity that California has is an enormous, enormous asset. It's incredibly valuable. So I have been inspired not only by really seeing the importance of the work, but also seeing progress. I talked a little bit, as you talked about some of the challenges we face. I don't want to also neglect how much progress we've made. I mean, if you look at the number of statewide officials now who are in California who are Latino, you see a very big representation from our Secretary of State to our insurance commissioner, to our attorney general. There's still some milestones we need to achieve. I want to be around when we have our first Latino senator from California in over 100 years, or our first governor. I'm just very fortunate that I love the work I do. And I also get to work with great people like Jonathan, right? So that inspires me as well, and all of the people at California Common Cause.
That's very sweet. Thank you. Okay, let's listen to let's check in with some of our listeners and viewers. We have an opportunity to take questions from folks listening, viewing. I'm still new to this. Okay, first question from Catherine. Other than COVID, what are the major impediments to a fair count on the census?
So, first of all, I think it's really the change in how the census is being conducted, right? Letting people know that there are options other than online participation, because like I said, that's the thing that the Bureau is promoting quite a bit. Making sure that people do understand that they can fill the questionnaire out on paper and send it in. So I think that is still a big part of our outreach. But I think also, and this is something we'd hoped would have abated a bit, but even before the pandemic, right, we had an administration that was taking actions, especially in the area of immigration, that really eroded people's trust in the confidentiality and privacy of the information that they were providing to the Bureau. That was made even worse when the administration proposed putting a citizenship question on the questionnaire. And so in this environment, people still need enormous reassurance that their information will not be used against them or their families. We still are finding people who think the citizenship question is still on the questionnaire. So I think that's the other barrier, is continuing.
Oh, we lost you, Rosalind. I will move to the next question that we have. It's also about census, and one that I can take as we wait for Rosalind to rejoin us. The question is from, I'm missing the name here, but it's a question about race and ethnicity on the census, and Rosalind mentioned this earlier. And it's a question about what changes were anticipated with the census with respect to race and ethnicity, and what are the problems there? And well, one of the problems is that both Latinos and people of Middle Eastern descent have to identify as white on the census. And they can then identify as a subsection. Hi, Rosalind, you're back. They can
Great.
identify as after identifying as white. Rosalind, I don't know if you heard the question, but we got a question from a viewer about the race and ethnicity question on the census, and what challenges there are there, and what changes were anticipated but didn't happen. And I'll just speak specifically with respect to people of Middle Eastern descent, Middle Eastern and North African descent. There was a long process of trying to change the race and ethnicity options, so people of Middle Eastern descent would have their own response category, because the idea that people of Middle Eastern descent, particularly in America after 9/11, have the same lived experience in this country or anywhere as white people is sort of nonsensical and almost laughable. And so what was happening was that people of Middle Eastern descent would frequently not check white, they would check other, they'd be confused as to their options. We'd end up having an undercount because of bad data categories. And also it just wasn't true to the lived experience of the community. And so there was a long process of trying to evaluate what a better approach would be. The Census Bureau and the federal government, prior to the arrival of the Trump administration, indicated that it was moving in the direction of reforming the race and ethnicity category so that people of Middle Eastern and North African descent would have a better option available to them. And then with the arrival of the Trump administration, those plans got scrapped, and we kept the same racial and ethnic categories as before. Rosalind, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, and I just wanted to, if you didn't mention this, Jonathan, apologies on the tech side. The issue for the Latino community is that the questionnaire asks first, are you Latino? And it doesn't consider Latino a race. And then it asks you, what race are you? So many Latinos would look at the race categories: white, Black, generally Asian, generally Native American, or other. They didn't see themselves. Many Latinos didn't see themselves in any of those racial categories. So they would mark that they were Latino, but they would also mark that they are some other race. Well, that just means that people weren't, or they leave that question blank. That also meant that as the Census Bureau was trying to reconcile data with other data sources which didn't have a some other race category, they would essentially assign Latinos to whatever race category they felt statistically they belonged in. In addition to adding a Middle Eastern North African category, the redesign that Jonathan talked about would have just made it one question: which of these categories best describes you? Mark all that apply. So you could have marked that you were Hispanic only. You could have marked you were Hispanic and African American. You could have marked you were Hispanic, Asian, Black, Native American. You would have had that choice, and you would have really diminished the some of the race category. But as Jonathan said, the administration did not let the Bureau move forward with that change.
Right.
And that's why the question is confusing for a lot of people.
Yeah, it is. And it's a source of frustration, both confusion and frustration. Some folks don't know how to answer, and we get bad data as a result. And some folks, even if they do know how to answer, feel as though that their identity and their lived experience is not actually represented by the census. And as a result, we get a less accurate picture of who the American family really is. We have another question from Noel, who asks, a group wanting to increase voter turnout, wouldn't it make more sense to contact people who do not vote regularly or have spotty voting consistency? And I think I can address this. I mentioned earlier that people will, making choices with their resources, will choose to target households that are 4 out of 5s or 5 out of 5s, households that are regular voters. And I should be clear that when I'm speaking in those terms, I'm talking about campaigns and candidates who have limited resources and a need to target the most likely voters. And so they're making a cold calculation: who do I want to target in order to get the most votes? Groups like ours, groups like NALEO, groups like California Common Cause, groups like all the other guests that I will probably have on over the course of 2020, work for organizations that do voter engagement, voter education, GOTV, get out the vote, GOTV, in communities that do have spotty voting records, that are low propensity voters. That's the term we often use, to try to bring new people into our democracy. But that's because we have a social mission of building a more equitable and more inclusive democracy. Candidates are just trying to win elections. And so their view is, I need to go right to the households that are most likely to vote.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, there are some candidates and parties that are realizing we want a long-term sustainable democracy. So they are thinking about how do we reach these low propensity voters, but it takes money and it takes time. And so our nation needs to make a better investment in the kind of work that nonpartisan, nonprofit voter engagement efforts do, because again, it's not something you can do. You can't just go in for one election and do your voter engagement and leave again, right? You really need a sustained effort.
Right, absolutely correct. Leonard and Barbara Harris ask, who do they contact about possibly volunteering with California Common Cause? Well, thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. In an election year, we are looking to engage as many members as possible in the process of protecting our democracy. And Alvin Valverde, who is the operations manager here at California Common Cause, will put his email address in the chat so people have a way to reach us and we can talk further about what you're interested in. We appreciate your outreach. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to Rosalind Gold, the Chief Public Policy Officer at the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, NALEO Educational Fund. Rosalind, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who joined us for lunch today.
Yeah, thank you. You can follow NALEO on Twitter at NALEO, N-A-L-E-O. You can follow NALEO on Facebook, facebook.com/naleo.org, and on Instagram at NALEO Ed Fund, so N-A-L-E-O-E-D Fund. You can follow California Common Cause on Twitter at Common Cause CA. You can follow me on Twitter at _Jonathan Stein. Thanks for joining us today. Remember to watch Lunch with California Common Cause live every Wednesday, 12 noon. We'll have a guest like Rosalind every other week going forward with short updates from me in the intervening weeks. As always, we appreciate you and your support of California Common Cause. Thank you for being with us in this fight. See you next week.